Before starting the topic of this video, pinned in the comments is an actual micro-survey. Doesn't take more than a minute. This is just to help me determine subjects for the series going forward. And the 3 most hated so far have already been planned. Very interestingly, of the current top 3, Runick is number 1, which is a shock to me because I thought Kashtira would take first handily. So let's actually get into why this archetype is as hated as it is. Runick is an archetype that was designed around the concept of milling out your opponent. Now, of course, this isn't why they've seen success, it's just a part of why they're so widely despised. There are 2 existing types of playstyles in the game that I'd classify as anti-playstyles, those being burn and mill. These are win conditions that are predicated on the idea your opponent does not get to play the game, which has led to them being 2 of the most despised playstyles in the game. In the case of mill, this is by getting rid of all of your opponent's cards so they lose by deck out. And burn, it's to stack up 8,000 damage through effects. These types of gameplay styles do not translate to modern Yu-Gi-Oh! In a healthy way. In a game that tends to be decided by the 2nd or 3rd turn, these styles have to adapt to that reality. And in that pursuit, they end up being the most toxic form of gameplay as a result. Runick attempts to address these issues in a healthy manner. However, despite their intent, their actual gameplay loop makes me ask, why even bother to preserve this playstyle? If even in its fairest form, it still leads to being one of the most frustrating playstyles to interact with. The intent with the gameplay loop behind mill is that your opponent has to more carefully manage their resources and find a way to defeat you before they've all been depleted. Runick has a ton of powerful interruption spells that mill out your opponent when they're used, with a restriction to skip your next battle phase. On face, this addresses the issue of toxicity with mill in a modern context, actively seeking to prolong the game for more back and forth interactions. In reality, this design comes across as slowly choking the opponent to death, holding them hostage for longer than the game truly is. The general design of most decks gets hosed by just how much interruption Runick is able to throw out. And of course, it's not like you'll be playing Runick by itself, leaving little room for any real form of engagement or interaction beyond the initial barrage. So this forces you into a scenario of drawing the out. Can you out-fountain and turn this non-game in Runick's favor into a non-game in your favor? What we're left with is an archetype that provides an overall negative gameplay experience. Magical Musket is an archetype that has an entire gimmick around being able to play their spell traps from hand while you control their monsters. However, they weren't very good, as Konami didn't want the monsters themselves to be good with that gimmick, having very few ways to get more than one body on field and insulate the gimmick. So, Runick would remove the monsters and have a field spell that lets you accomplish the same thing to far greater effect, all while having resilient protection, with the main difference being that Runick is all spells, and good. This creates an archetype that is entirely dependent upon its field spell to even function. Regardless of how good or consistent it is to get to, this design is always bad. It's one thing for an archetype to have a weakness, but it's just outright poor design to functionally put a self-destruct button on them. It creates a scenario where invalidating the deck entirely is the win condition, rather than genuinely outplaying it. This means the deck also has to account for the clear liability that Fountain can end up being. So you have Hugin to protect it, a card with 0 once per turns printed on it, and the ability to cycle itself back so you can once again use it to protect Fountain, making the deck all the more frustrating. Hugin searches Fountain and is possible to summon with every spell, functionally being a Link 1 that searches the field spell. But unlike a Link 1, you don't ever have to commit a normal summon to get to it. All of their spells are designed with a choice of effects, either summoning a Runick from your extra, or another effect that mills your opponent in the process. A sizable portion of them are strong interruptions. On top of the power of these effects, the form of milling is banishing, being able to banish multiple cards from the top of your opponent's deck. Flashing Fire banishes 2, Freezing Curses banishes 3, and Destruction hits 4. While all of them do banish cards, not all of them are universally applicable. With how much banishing happens as a result, though, it's very likely they pry away crucial resources. This turns games into a miserable game of chance. Did they hit a crucial piece of your deck? Well, scoop them up and go next. People joke about the banishment becoming the second graveyard, but very few decks actually use it or interact with it, so the fact Runick banishes what it mills makes it all the more frustrating. If they sent to grave, there would more likely be actual potential repercussions and more chances for dynamic interactions in the game, seeing as the graveyard is far more interactable than the banishment. But since they do banish, it just ends up completely screwing over a majority of decks. Then, to add insult to injury, the deck has draw power. On top of having a resilient low commitment to the field, they can replenish their resources very easily with Fountain. So, as you're consistently losing upwards of cards from your deck, they don't, and also likely get back all of the interruptions they just spent. Meaning, next time you get to go again, if you can even do anything, you'll likely be walking into the same exact tunnel. The battle phase skipping is only really a means to deter using the deck generically, which it doesn't even manage to do anyways. The fact Runick Tempai, a literal paradox, was a real deck that actual humans played with actual real success, and not a joke that people uttered, is proof this restriction failed to be a restriction. If anything, the skip only encouraged people to adopt the most deplorable approach to deck building: floodgates. Like I said earlier, the prolonging of the game only really ends up holding your opponent hostage in a scenario that can't win already. With the added ability to just get floodgates, you would just ensure your opponent can't play at all. At that point, I would honestly prefer they just end it all anyways. Since all the runic spells are functionally just instant fusion, plenty of decks can abuse those free bodies. While they do have the restriction of only being able to summon them to the EMZ, you could still easily manage this by converting them into other monsters, most commonly turning Hugin into a gigantic sprite, or using them to make cards like Barone. Once again, Runick's design only ended up encouraging a degenerate playstyle. With Runick's existing structure, there's nothing remotely interesting going on from their own strategy, and there certainly isn't any real fun to be had while playing against it in pure, leaving us with an archetype that's hated by a majority of people and liked by people that are willing to overlook war crimes. The problem with Runick is that there's not much depth to the deck beyond Fountain. The deck has mill, but no genuine productive game plan with its own cards. The fact the deck relies on Fountain to even function leaves it feeling like a shallow one-trick pony. The deck should be able to do more in general without Fountain. Before discussing new cards for the archetype, Konami should just ban all the floodgates already. This is a recurring theme in this series. A lot of archetypes that people hate have a negative reputation for playing floodgates, but they themselves have no actual relation to them. It's just that they get away with exploiting these cards. The reality is that they just shouldn't exist, period, because we'll only end up in this same scenario with different decks. It's unhealthy design for the game on a broader scale, and only serves as a means of souring the reputation of decks that can use them. Floodgates are an entirely different topic for a different video, but all that needs to be emphasized here is, as floodgates exist now in the modern game, they're just auto-win buttons and not genuine reductions of overflow. When this is paired with archetypes that have annoying and or absurdly strong design principles, it just creates a cocktail of misery. And the end goal of the game is to actually be able to down something enjoyable. One of the reasons people like Runick is because of the flexibility behind their card design. Every card gets your game plan going, so you never have to worry about seeing a specific card in order for the deck to work, creating a level of variance in gameplay since you won't always be using the same effects out of the same cards. But quite a few of them are completely worthless in their secondary effect, leaving it so some of them might as well just be the summoning effect. But even then, people just don't play them in general. Because of Runick lacking a constructive game plan, unless they're the best of the best in removal, they just aren't worth a damn. I think Magnificestorm takes this design philosophy in a more compelling direction, giving a means to always out Fountain ironically, though they clearly wanted you to play these with Runick, printing a card like this. They all search MST for one of their effects, similar to how every Runick spell functionally searches Fountain. They also designed the archetype to not only just be able to get MST at all times, but be able to get use out of it at all times. One of the issues with back row removal in general. It's something to take note of. The most important difference between them and Runick is philosophy. All the Magnificestorm cards have constructive structure behind their other effects, so every card has universal application to be used for either effect. Since Runick's design is only disruptive, and the monsters don't actually build up to something offensive, they're all worthless if there's nothing to disrupt. So the deck needs to have at least some level of productivity added onto its design. The one detail I can at least appreciate about Runick's milling is that they don't banish face down. While effects triggering on banish aren't super common, I'm convinced they were naive enough to think it was relevant, which is overall better than banishing face down to ensure 0 decks in the game actually manage with it. I guess unless you're playing Gren Maju exactly. But I believe there's a way to make more sinister use of the fact they don't banish face down, while actually making the deck far healthier. Designing cards that put back a number of banished cards for cost, stacking them on the top or bottom of the deck. I legitimately don't care if it's antithetical to the deck's existing game plan. The deck's game plan is antithetical to gameplay. Creating a new wave that pivots it into resource management instead of purely mill is more engaging for both players. Since they don't banish face down, you have knowledge of all your opponent's cards, and now that you're moving them in and out of play, you're effectively deciding what cards your opponent is allowed to have at what time. In a way, establishing trades you can afford to make to advance gameplay for both of you. This also makes Smiting Storm a much better card, especially going second, as it now becomes an effective way to set up these banishment costs. This also makes it so the restrictions to prolong the game feel less like an insult and more like a proposition that a game can actually still be played. You get to hold your opponent's cards hostage without removing them from the game entirely, all while uniquely making use of your opponent's cards as a resource for your own deck. It turns the most frustrating and unengaging part of the deck's design into something far more engaging for both players. One of the issues these cards face, though, is that you now have cards that are potentially dead, relying on you seeing enough of the old cards and the ones that can do so immediately in order to get them online. So you risk bricking on the wrong half of the deck. However, the deck already has the established duality of choice effects. These cards can very well have the same summon effect as the old ones, but they could also decide to give these cards a different primary effect. Get this, they could actually design the deck to have main deck monsters, and these cards could summon them from deck, further building on the idea of them being opposite to the original spells. Adding main deck monsters to Runick also opens up a window to new design in general. They could have design that's an inverse of bestials to fall in theme with this new direction. This can very well build upon the existing style, targeting a banished card and stacking it in the deck to summon themselves as a quick effect from hand, giving the deck things they can actually do without the need for Fountain to be on field. If the targeting of banished cards applies to both sides of the field, there can even be design around banishing your own cards and doing so face down. This can be a part of the secondary effect on the new wave of spells, banishing cards from your own deck face down. Banishing them face down not only prevents generic abuse with cards that trigger on banish, but once again takes advantage of gameplay nuances. As the player that owns the cards, you can view what cards are in your face down banishment, but your opponent can't, allowing you to build up a reserve of resources and knowledge your opponent doesn't have access to. Then you could stack your banished cards on top of your deck and use Fountain's draws to functionally add them to hand. This adds another layer of depth to their design in a way that fits its own theme, reflecting a pursuit to control and possess knowledge, both from your side of the world and your opponent's, which is what Hugin and Munin functionally represent in Norse mythology, being Odin's eyes granting him knowledge of everything going on. Something about Runick's existing design that needs elaboration is the EMZ. Why do they summon to the EMZ exclusively? I get that it's an attempt at a balancing measure to prevent how abusable they are, but it also comes at the cost of every name that isn't Hugin. Give the deck ways to move cards out of the EMZ. That way you still have to play dedicated Runick to actually use more of the Runick cards. I feel as though they saw an archetype with multiple removal spells and draw power, looked at Sky Striker, and went into DEFCON 1 to make sure that was never possible without thinking about the greater ramifications. Restrictions have to serve both the game's ecosystem and the deck itself, not one or the other. If you under-restrict a deck, you potentially create a monster. If you over-restrict a deck, you create a waste of time. Forsaking one over the other is just going to provide an unsatisfactory end product regardless. While on the topic of the EMZ, we have spells that are also monsters. But what if we had monsters that were also spells? Oh, right. The fact they summon to the EMZ only also makes sense with pendulums. It also adds another layer of duality in the deck, not just in the inverse of spell to monster, but also in how the old cards work. If the new cards summon from deck and summon these pendulums, once they're sent to the face-up extra deck, the old runic spells can in fact summon them back, since runic spells can summon any runic from the extra. It doesn't matter if it's face-up or face-down. They can be designed to let you search any runic spell if you really want to go all out on the duality and inversion gimmick. Since any spell gave you any monster originally, you can have design where any monster gets you to any spell, helping the deck better find its way to specific spells they'd want, either an interruption you're missing, or in actually establishing the combo between Golden Droplet and Dispelling. Originally, I thought to myself about how you can make a card like Golden Droplet better, but I realized you don't really have to. If the deck has more spell searching, it's at least worth considering at one, especially assuming that the Hecatonkari monsters end up worth playing, since they provide you more benefits than just dispelling for playing Golden Droplet. The fact that banishes 4 cards does make it a more appealing card with the new banishment control angle, as it would set up just about any cost and can be activated at any point, making the fact that it's the biggest mill to make it your best starter, with the potential benefit that the draw becomes less of a negative with surrounding cards. To further establish the duality in banishing cards, Pendulum Runics in Scale could banish cards off the top of the deck on activation, just like other runic spells. If you want to be cute about it, the amount of cards they banish can be equal to their pen scale. But they have a very important distinction from the other runic spells. They banish from your deck face down. However, if you control Fountain, you can choose to banish your opponents face up instead. Just don't give them high scales, and this is all good. This gives Runic a set structure around the new established game plan and emphasizes a new way to look at Fountain in the deck, providing a benefit for controlling Fountain, but not being completely useless without it present. Since the benefit of Fountain in Runic's current design is the fact you don't lose, I think finding more ways to turn it into a bonus over a liability is just better for the deck's overall health. Pendulum sticking in Scale does present an issue though. If you draw too many Pendulum Runics, you only get to use 2, so if they aren't converting to something else for the deck, you have a new problem. But this is an opportunity to solve an old problem with a new one. Runic is fusion-oriented without actually fusion summoning. They could introduce the ability to fuse using your scales to perform ethical runic fusions, seeing as none of their cards actually perform a fusion summon, clearing out your scales and allowing for you to make runic fusions that aren't constricted to the EMZ. Munin is the existing name that has it the worst. He searches a card that's just bad. While he provides another form of protection that covers for the gaps in Hugin's protection, which is fitting thematically, Hugin gets the job done well enough and actually gets a useful card. Munin does protect your set cards, making up for a lack of Fountain, but because of the EMZ issue, he's forced into Hugin's shadow no matter what. If it's possible to summon them outside of the EMZ, he finally has room to be played. You'd probably also want a new runic fusion that can search a runic pendulum, so you can always see this facet of the deck as well. If they really want to, they could include pendulum fusions. It would be interesting to see Runic as the first archetype to fully take advantage of pendulum fusions as a main gimmick. When it comes to their existing fusions, there are a couple issues that need addressing. As I said earlier with Munin, the fact you can only control one of them at a time limits the usability of them all. Designing other ways to summon them opens up room to use the rest of them, but some of them have other baggage to unpack. Munin's continuous spell search is embarrassing considering Allure is the only target. While Allure can technically become a better card with my proposed idea for support, ultimately I'd hope they receive another continuous spell that makes Munin's search worthwhile. What is Gary rooted in? Because Frecky is Frecky. Is it Jerry? Seinfeld in Norse lore? Jerry does potentially present an interesting avenue of play for Runic to expand on, Since the effects of runic spells prevent you from attacking, you have to run them in before using any if you're using the recovery effect. This highlights the potential to have more depth in choosing to battle before firing off other effects. And if we're making these fusions ethically with the pendulums, you now have a window to attack with them before doing so. As the deck is now, Jerry is designed specifically to recover Fountain and do absolutely nothing else. The destruction effect is cool and occasionally comes up, but more times than not, he's just recurring Fountain or being used as a body for something else. So finding more ways for Runick to leverage battle, not as a means of OTKing, but as a means of performing more abstract offensive effects, gives the deck more depth around the battle prevention as it shapes windows to use other aspects of the deck itself. Frecky sort of has this going for it, but banishing 2 off the top really isn't selling it. You do get back a quick play if you can crash him, but that's not super compelling either. One thing to note about Frecky is that it's the only one that actively wants to be in the EMZ. Unfortunately, the fact is tied to its most irrelevant effect. Genuine payoffs for different names in the EMZ would better build on the deck's existing flexibility, because even if we do away with them only being able to summon to the EMZ, the one that ends up in the EMZ should offer something unique for it. Lastly, there's Sleipnir. It pretends it's another incentive for Gold Droplet, but the token makes no sense in the context of Runick. They don't really use bodies as resources, so it feels like it's only here to point at the screen and remind you it's a generator reference, without any actual useful tie-in to Runick's design. If they actually start making fusions the normal way, at the very least the token can be used for that, assuming there are even more ways to fuse. But other than that, I really don't see what purpose the token serves beyond being a shallow reference to the lore connection. Sleipnir is an SP for Runick, which is really good, but for some reason, they decided it should have the Uni Dreadnought windows for its effect, leaving it to be kind of underwhelming. But this design does highlight another way to move names out of the EMZ. This type of design could be expanded upon with other fusions that leave and come back to help retain names. Have them disappear for effects to leave an opening. Runick is an archetype that with its current design structure serves as little more than an annoyance. A concoction of some of the game's worst design philosophies bundled up into a single package. Yet there's still roots to something far more engaging and compelling under the surface. It's just a matter of studying those roots and seeing it grow into a healthier deck.